Rumo, Book 1. Rumo, Book 1, Overworld. 1. The Silver Thread. Rumo was good at fighting. At the beginning of his story, however, he still had no inkling of this, nor did he know that he was a Wolperting and would one day become Zamonia's most illustrious hero. He had no name, nor did he have the faintest recollection of his parents. He didn't know where he came from or where he would go. All he knew was that the farmyard where he grew up was his kingdom, king of the farmyard. For Rumo, each day began when the farmer's entire family, 7 Hakonian dwarfs, formed a doting circle around the sleepy puppy's basket and woke him with a melodious Hakonian song. They showered him with caresses, they tickled him behind the ears, rocked him in their arms, stroked his fur and kissed his tiny horns, marks of affection which he acknowledged with a pleasurable grunt. Whenever Rumo tottered on his 4 clumsy little legs, he instantly became the center of attention. All his activities were applauded. He was even fondled and tickled for tripping over his own paws. The Hakonians set aside the freshest milk for him, barbecued him the most succulent sausages, reserved him the coolest place in the shade and warmest place beside the stove. They went around on tiptoe when he was having his afternoon rest, and regaled him with apple pie and whipped cream when he yawningly awoke. There were always volunteers ready to romp with Rumo or allow him to bite him with the toothless gums, and at night, when he had tired himself out with play, they groomed his fur with a soft brush and sang him to sleep. Yes, Rumo was the uncrowned king of the farmyard. There were many other animals on the farm. The dairy cows, horses, and pigs were all much bigger and stronger and more useful than Rumo, but none enjoyed the same popularity. The only creature that failed to acknowledge his supremacy was a black, long-necked goose twice his size, which hissed malevolently whenever he ventured too close, so he gave her as wide a berth as possible. Pains in the mouth. One morning Rumo was awakened in his basket, not by the Hakonian's melodious singing, but by a sharp pain. There was a strange sensation in his mouth. The interior normally felt like a wet, slimy cave in which his tongue glided over soft, smooth, mounded shapes, but it had now acquired a new and alarming feature. In his upper jaw, just inside the upper lip, the gum had gone taut, and something sharp seemed to be growing beneath it. This was the source of the throbbing pain Rumo found so disagreeable. He decided to invite due sympathy and caresses by informing a wider public of his condition, but there was no one around. He would have to toil across the barn where the Hakonians were usually engaged at this hour for reasons Rumo found unfathomable, and tossing hay around with pitchforks. Experience had taught him that to route to the barn was fraught with difficulty. Through the kitchen, across the veranda with its menacing splinters, down the steps, across the muddy farmyard, past the stupid goose, round the drinking trough, which was always surrounded by pig dung. It was a wearisome trip, and Rumo preferred to undertake it in the arms of one of the farmer's children. If only he didn't have to go down on all fours and trip over his own paws in the process, how lovely it would be if he could walk on 2 legs like the Hakonians. Rumo climbed out of his basket, planted his hind legs on the floor, and straightened up with a groan. He swayed first to the right, then to the left, and finally stood straight as an arrow. Hey, it was easy! He set off, striding along like a grown-up Hakonian. He was filled with pride, a novel and inspiring sensation. Without stumbling once, he plodded all the way across the kitchen, pushed open the door, which was ajar, and even managed to descend the 4 veranda steps. Then he marched off across the farmyard. The morning sun warmed his fur. The air felt cool and refreshing. Rumo drew a deep breath, his 4 paws on his hips, and walked past the black goose, which he now matched in height. She backed away, staring at him in astonishment, and started to hiss something nasty, but she was too flabbergasted to get it out. Rumo didn't spare the bird a glance. He simply strode on, feeling bigger and more pleased with himself than ever before. The Silver Thread. Rumo paused to enjoy the warmth of the sunlight on his fur. He blinked in the dazzling glare and shut his eyes, and there it was again, the world he saw whenever he did this. It was a world of smells that floated and flickered before his inner eye in hundreds of different colors, thin, fluttering wisps of red, yellow, green, and blue light. The green light was given off by the luxuriant rosemary bush growing right beside him, the yellow by the delicious lemon cakes being baked in the kitchen, the red by the smoke of the smoldering compost heap, the blue by the cool morning breeze, which was laden with the tangy scent of the nearby ocean, and there were many, many more colors, some of them dirty and ugly, like the brown of the dung in which the pig was wallowing. What really astonished Rumo, however, was a color he had never smelt before. High above all these terrestrial scents floated a silver ribbon. It was thin and delicate, no more than a thread, in fact, but he could clearly see it with his inner eye. Rumo was overcome by a strangely restless feeling, a vague and unprecedented yearning to leave everything behind and set off into the blue of his own. He involuntarily drew a deep breath and shivered, so strong and splendid was the feeling that arose within him. Deep in his childish little heart, Rumo sensed that if he used the silver thread of scent as a guide and followed it to its source, happiness would await him there. But first he must go into the barn and make a fuss. He opened his eyes and strode on. He was standing in front of the big red curtains that kept the sunlight from parching straw in the barn and setting it ablaze, but he came to a halt. A strange new sensation had prompted him to interrupt his triumphal progress. His knees went weak when he had to fight off an urge to go down on all fours again. The blood shot to his head, his forepaws trembled, sweat broke out on his forehead. Rumo didn't realize that the curtains marked a new chapter in his life, and that he was about to slough off his animal heritage. He didn't know, either, that if he walked into the barn on his hind legs, he would be regarded quite differently, because a Wolperting walking upright was treated with considerably more respect than a wild Wolperting. All he did sense was that his entry into the barn would be an event of importance. Bewildered and intimidated by his own audacity, he felt his little heart beat wildly. Rumo was suffering from stage fright. He did what every actor does when afflicted by this form of nervous tension. He peeked through the curtains to check out the audience. Cautiously thrusting his head through the crack, he peered into the dark barn's interior. One-eyed giants. It was dark inside, and his sun-dazzled eyes took a moment to adapt themselves to the new conditions. All he made out at first were the shadowy shapes of wooden beams and bales of straw interspersed with shafts of sunlight slanting down through the barn windows. He blinked a couple of times and saw that something wholly unexpected was going on in there. The Hakonians were not engaged in filling sacks with straw. On the contrary, they themselves were being stuffed into sacks by some huge one-eyed creatures with horns and shaggy black fur. Rumo didn't worry too much at first. He was used to mysterious things happening daily in the grown-up world. Only a few days ago, a camaraderie had been led into the farmyard. What a commotion! Everyone had scattered in different directions like hens before a thunderstorm, and the camaraderie had bleated for hours like a mad thing. Now it was tethered there, placidly munching the fodder in its nose-bag, and had come a boring, everyday sight. The giants didn't perturb Rumo either. Hakonian farmers kept animals just as hideous. For instance, the thigh of an Ordian swamp hog was bearable only if he knew how delicious it tasted when stripped of its warty hide and roasted on a spit. But there was something about the horned giants that differentiated them from the marsh hogs, the evil glint in their eyes. Rumo couldn't interpret it because he lacked experience. He didn't even know what evil was, so he parted the curtains and strode into the barn. His strange fright had evaporated to be replaced by icy composure. For the first time ever, Rumo became aware of his ability to remain almost preternaturally calm in a tense situation. He took a step forward and announced his presence in the usual Wolpertingian manner. He gave 2 self-important sniffs. No one took a scrap of notice, he had to admit. The giants continued to stuff the Hakonians into sacks. The Hakonians continued to wail and whimper. Rumo felt hurt. They were ignoring him. Him who could walk on his hind legs. Him whose mouth was sore. Suddenly he knew what to do. He could speak. He had learned to walk straight off, so why shouldn't he speak as well? He decided to attract attention by uttering 2 sentences. First, "I can walk." Second, "My mouth hurts." That would make everyone take notice. That would make them shower him with congratulations and expressions of sympathy. He opened his mouth, drew a deep breath, and uttered his 2 sentences. "Ahawa! Wawaha!" The words hadn't come out quite as he intended, but they had emerged from his lips and sounded impressive. What was more, they worked. The shaggy black giants stopped stuffing Hakonians into sacks, and the Hakonians stopped wailing and whimpering. Every eye turned in Rumo's direction. All of a sudden his legs went trembling and his backside felt heavy as he led. He struggled to retain his balance for a moment, then toppled backwards into the dust. Rumo had chalked up a new experience. He had made his first big blunder of his life. One of the giants stalked over to him, grabbed him by the ears, and thrust him into a sack. The story of the Demonicals. Demonicals were a vicious type of one-eyed giant found only on roaming rock. It was regarded as scientifically inaccurate to classify these monsters as members of the Zamonian pirate fraternity, since pirates only sail the seas in ships, strictly speaking, and do at least obey the rules of navigation. Demonicals, on the other hand, sailed the seas on a natural phenomenon, the legendary roaming rock, a buoyant amalgam of oxygen and minerals the size of a city block, and obeyed no rules except the laws of nature. They drifted around at random on their holly rock, spreading panic and terror whenever the tides happened to wash them ashore. If asked what fate he hoped to avoid at all costs, the average Zamonian tended to reply, being captured by the Demonicals. There were captains who scuttled their own ships merely because they had sighted roaming rock on the horizon. They preferred to drown themselves and their crew rather than fall prey to these monsters. No coastal region was safe from them, and a few of Zamonian seaside towns had not been raided by them in the course of the centuries. Roaming rock was originally a huge mass of lava vomited into the ocean by a subterranean volcano many thousands of years ago. There it cooled and rose to the surface because of an oxygen trapped inside it. From sea level it resembled a group of steepingly jutting rocky islands, but it was really a composite structure like an iceberg whose jagged extremities were visible, while most of it is underwater. We do not know how and when the Demonicals settled on their floating island, but accounts in town archives of raids by vandals of the Demonicalian origin suggest that it must have been several centuries ago. Presumably one of their raiding parties sighted the great rock stranded off the coast of Samonia, climbed aboard it, and was unexpectedly swept out to sea when the tide turned. It seems that the Demonicals abandoned themselves to their fate and made no attempt to influence the direction taken by their floating island. They were too mean and inventive to equip their bizarre vessel with sails, rudders, or anchors, so it was left to the tides and ocean currents to determine which ill-starred stench of coast they landed on. If washed up somewhere by a favorable current, the Demonicals immediately went ashore, raiding towns and villages, taking prisoners until the waves bore them and their floating island away again. Broadly speaking, such was the not particularly heartwarming story of the Demonicals, and this time they had been stranded on the coast by Hakonia. Rumo still had no forebodings, even when he was put into the sack. All grown-ups looked like giants to him, and he was used to them picking him up and carrying him around for unfathomable reasons. The sack seemed merely a new variation of an old game, but his toothache had really bothering him. Persistent pain was something that conflicted with his cozy picture of the world. He had occasionally had to endure pain, but never for long. A tumble on the nose, a splinter from the veranda, and his paw. Far from subsiding, however, this new pain was steadily becoming more intense. Worse still, another place in his mouth started to hurt in the same way. Even so, he lay there quietly and scarcely moved. The Demonicals' diet. For some days now, the Demonicals left behind on roaming rock had noticed how the rising waves were tugging at their floating home. Only a few hours and they would be back on the high seas once more. Nervously they scanned the cliffs surrounding the muddy tongue of land on which they were stranded. Nearly all of the other raiders had returned from their forays, but a dozen were still missing. A spine-chilling sound, almost like a cry, pierced the mist that floated between the sea and the mainland. It was the note of a seashell horn, which sounded to the Demonicals' ears like music. The dozen stragglers were returning at last. The one-eyed vandals appeared on the cliff-top, triumphantly holding aloft the bulging sacks in which their prey were still. They registered this with satisfaction, struggling and kicking violently. What is the worst thing that one living creature can do to another? Those brave enough to pursue that question to its logical conclusion might the Demonicals' diet answer it as follows. Eating a fellow creature alive. It is quite all right to kill an Ornean marsh hog as quickly and painlessly as possible. Strip off its hideous warty hide, stuff it with rosemary, and roast it on a spit. On that point all Zamonians, except the vegetarians among them, were agreed, but to cut the beating heart out of a live pig and devour it raw was quite beyond the pale. Indeed, there were laws against it. Of course, not everyone obeyed those laws, werewolves, for example, and one or two other less sensitive life forms. However, no one could more blatantly have contravened the general agreement not to eat things alive than Demonicals. The one-eyed demons enjoyed their food, if what they devoured was still moving. When on the high seas, they ate live fish. If they captured a ship, they wolfed its entire contents alive, captain, crew, passengers, even the last rat, cockroach, and weevil in its hold. If they became stranded somewhere, they ate the local inhabitants. It mattered little what form of prey they ate. Demonicals weren't choosy. They would even have devoured a spider which, provided it was still twitching nicely. Liveliness was the main criterion by which the one-eyed giants judged the quality of their fare. They had developed some ingenious ways of keeping their victims alive for as long as possible, gobbling them up. They saved vital organs such as the heart, brain, and lungs till last, but eventually devoured those too, together with toenails, bones, scales, claws, eyelashes, and tentacles. The Demonicals thought it particularly important to keep any sound-producing organs and innards intact to the end. The tongue, larynx, and vocal cords were regarded as special delicacies to be reserved for the culmination of a meal. Screams, groans, and whimpers took the place of a pinch of salt, a hint of garlic, and the scent of a bay leaf. The Demonicals were the gourmets of the ear as well as the eye. They divided their food into 3 grades, the lowest of these, acceptable only in an emergency, comprised creatures that were alive but barely moved and couldn't make sounds, for instance mussels, oysters, snails, and jellyfish. In the medium grade were creatures which, although unable to scream, could twitch or wriggle, fish of all kinds, octopuses, lobsters, crabs, and marine spiders. The highest category included creatures capable of speaking, screaming, yelling, screeching, crowing, twittering, bleating, or making some noises of some other kind. The Demonicals didn't care what their victims were, Northlanders or Hakonians, gargoyles or warburtings, coastal dwarfs, seagulls, or chimpanzees, as long as they made a frightful din while being eaten. If the Hakonians had only known how effectively they were whetting the Demonicals' appetite by moaning and struggling inside their stacks, they would have all kept as quiet as Rumo, who was still wondering when his curious grown-up game would come to an end.